My name is Liz Seaton. I'm a curator here at the Beach Museum of Art. Welcome to this lecture organized in conjunction with the exhibition Chipping the Block, Painting the Silk, the Prints of Norma Bassett Hall, on view in the Weefald Gallery through December 15th. We're very fortunate today to have the exhibition's guest curator, Dr. Joby Patterson, here to speak to us about her research, her adventures, as she put it. After the lecture and time for questions, Joby will be on hand outside this room at the little table nearby to sell and sign her beautiful and well-researched and written book on Norma Bassett Hall, published by Pomegranate Press of Portland, Oregon. Before introducing Joby, I want to thank the exhibition's sponsors, Annette and Stephen Huff, Russell Clay Harvey and Patty McGivern, and Mary Helm Pollock and Lawrence W. Pollock. I think Clay was planning to attend. I don't know if he's here. Thank you, Clay. Thank you. Now let me introduce Joby. Joby Patterson is an art historian specializing in early 20th century American printmaking. Joby earned her doctorate in art history from Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj, Romania, resulting in a book on the wooden churches of the Carpathian region of Eastern Europe. And I think she had a Fulbright fellowship for that project. Joby is author of the book Bertha E. Jaques and the Chicago Society of Etchers, and a contributor to various publications, including our own 2005 exhibition catalog, Printmaking and American Women Artists, 1910 to 1960. Good to work with Joby again today. Her current book project is a monograph on the American architectural print artist, Louis C. Rosenberg. Joby lives in Eugene, Oregon, and is here with her husband, Jim. Where are you, Jim? In the audience. Welcome to K-State, Joby.
Thank you, Liz. I don't need to keep that microphone then. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay, good. I titled this The Adventures of Norma Bassett Hall, the adventures of an art historian, Norma Bassett Hall, the case of Norma Bassett Hall. I thought it might be fun to talk about some of the research experiences that I had, but prior to that I thought also I would give a bit of a background on Norma. So this is kind of a two-part thing, and then toward the end I'm going to discuss the ways that prints are made when the system that Norma used is employed, the Japanese system. She makes the most delectable block prints, wrote artist and critic Bertha Jaques in 1928. Less than 2 years later, block prints by Norma Bassett Hall were exhibited at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. This event marked Norma's entrance onto the stage of national recognition. It was followed by many other exhibitions over the course of her life. One could ask, if this happened, why was Norma Bassett Hall not so well known after her death? Why didn't her recognition continue? First, after she died, her prints remained in the family, with few making it into public collections where they could be seen and exhibited. More importantly, her papers were apparently lost, thus discouraging anyone to engage in further pursuit of her life and her work. Finally, the times in which Norma lived changed drastically, as did art and art trends. Thus, after her death in 1957, there were very few group exhibitions in which Norma's work was shown, and no solo exhibitions. Traditionalist artists and the so-called arts and crafts artists were forgotten with the rise of modernism at mid-century. It is only recently that they have begun to recover a presence. In 2009, David Keel of the Whitney Museum said, "We know far too little of the printmaking which occurred west of the Mississippi between the two world wars. These stories need to be told before we can piece together the quilt of printmaking in America. Norma, who worked in Oregon, Kansas, and the Southwest, definitely forms a piece of this quilt, and it was my goal, through the publication of the book and the traveling exhibition, Chipping the Block, to promote awareness of Bassett Hall and contribute to knowledge of the era. Let me put Norma Bassett Hall in something of a broader world historical context. Over 100 years ago, World War I began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo. In fact, it's only 10 more days until that war was over in November of 2018, November 11th. A year later, in 1915, a young student at the Portland Art Association, Norma Bassett, who won the first scholarship at the Portland Art Association for her clever work, had drawn her studies to a close with a plein air course and had been admitted to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago as an advanced student. By March of 1916, she was deep into her studies. After graduation in 1918, Norma Bassett launched her career as a block print artist and continued to make prints for some 30 years until around 1950. For me, it's been a 10-year road of exploration to learn about the events of Norma Bassett Hall's life. She lived an adventurous and exciting life, and I continue to be impressed that she and her husband, Arthur William Hall, packed so much into those 35 years. They were restless travelers and lived in many places. After Norma's death in 1957, not only is it likely that her parents were discarded, but essentially no woodblocks or other artist materials remained, and there was little correspondence except what relatives or friends had kept. To make things more difficult, Norma hardly dated anything, and certainly not her prints. Even on Christmas cards, she would simply write December 23rd. She would know that you automatically know what the year is, and of course you would, but she didn't ever date them any further than the day and the month. She did date 2 cards in the titles, however. So I've had to be more of a sleuth than I had initially had imagined, and that partly explains a long time in research. It could be assumed that I was attracted to her because of the appeal of her art, but in fact, initially that wasn't the case. I wanted to know how a woodblock artist fared in the greater scheme of the movements and trends in printmaking during her era, when other forms of printmaking dominated. So my first curiosity was intellectual rather than aesthetic. I had hardly seen a print at this point. The only prints I had seen were in the biographical dictionaries. They were, photos that big. In my previous research, I had taken on the study of 745 intaglio works, mostly etchings, that were made by members of the Chicago Society of Etchers at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, which informed me about the history of prints in early 20th century America. After that project, I had grown tired of black and white prints, so for my new research interests, I decided I'd go the opposite direction. I would search for a color block print artist. That could have been an intaglio color artist. I just had to have color. I just had to get away from the black and white. I hoped I could at least partly position that artist against the backdrop of history that I already knew. I recalled Norma. She was married to a man, Arthur W. Hall, who was a member of the Chicago Society of Etchers. This was the woman, according to Jaques, who made the most delectable block prints. The biographical dictionaries listed her as born, that is Norma, born in 1888, 1889, and 1890. Not even any, consensus about when this artist was born. However, they all gave her birthplace as Oregon. Being a woman only enhanced her appeal for me. How did she survive in the art world of early 20th century America? Then I found Haystack Rock on the internet. It was Oregon. When it was called Haystack Rick for the 3rd time on the internet, that did it. She deserved better, and I continued with my research in searching for materials. I experienced many adventures and surprises down every facet or angle I took in pursuing a line of inquiry. Being an art historian for me is always an adventure. It's first connecting and then understanding the interconnections between a work of art or an artist or a movement with its time and its past history. It is putting art into its original context. That provides more information about the cultural history, and more questions are then asked. Through a hunch, I discovered the collection of more than 40 prints at the University of Arizona. Iris, I call the miracle print, due to its exquisite composition, its perfect execution on thin Japanese gompi paper, suggesting the pillar print form, a popular vertical format in Japanese printmaking. I found the title in an exhibition list, exhibited early in 1925. I couldn't believe it. How could this be? I realized I had come upon a significant artist. And also in that collection of Arizona, I suddenly realized that her scope was much wider than, I didn't know what her scope was, but I saw the scope widen, because there they had the black and white oil-based prints. They have water-based prints like this one, and they also have a collection of seriographs. All those things together were a surprise for me. I had no idea that she was doing all these media. After the Arizona discovery, I followed through, gleaning more exciting information from the prints, and new questions arose. But eventually, I was again feeling quite discouraged at finding little more for 2 years. There was no rational reason why I should research an artist whose personal papers were gone. Then I experienced a grand step forward when Cottage and Skye was featured on Antiques Roadshow in Portland. My son Aram, who lives in Portland, called me. This print was sold at a Goodwill in Portland for $1.49. So this owner took it to Antiques Roadshow and showed Todd Wyman from New York, who was a print expert, this print. And I hadn't watched the program, but my son called me, and he said, "Don't worry, I know the owner. She's on my soccer team." So I was lucky, and I called that woman, and finally she found some other people who were members of the family who had called into the program, and the program referred them to her. And from that, I became very fortunate, because I found a member of the family from Portland who lives in Gresham, which is a suburb of Portland. So then from him, I found 13 family members, some of whom didn't even know each other. So it was wonderful, because everybody was willing, down to the last person, to communicate whatever knowledge they had to me, to show me their prints, to cooperate in any way. And then I knew another thing about Norma, that she was very well liked, because all these descendants, no one said, "No, I don't, she was that old aunt." So that taught me something, and ever since then, that's all I've heard about her, are these wonderful reports from people who knew her or knew others who knew her. Finally, in researching her, I learned that the family prints came from boxes under beds. I waited while people got these things out. From dining room walls, someone took her print off the wall, from filing cabinets, from the top of closet shelves, and even bottom dresser drawers. And there were a few small prints in scrapbooks. So everybody got out what they had and let me see, and it was so exciting. One nephew had preserved a cache of about 10 postcards that Norma sent to her sister from the south of France. Norma wrote that they were skylarking about Provence. "We have at last invested in the long talked of bicycles, so we will do a lot of skylarking about the country when the weather is fine. We want to explore some of the quaint old towns that are scattered all about the hills here." And all my messages are always so short, because these are just on postcards, but that's what that postcard said. The Hall spent 2 years traveling in Scotland and Provence. Some of Norma's print titles revealed specific locales in Europe, like Street of Villefranche, but others were vague, like Village Fountain or Provençal Village. But I had enough information to go to France to see what we could find. Actually, I can't tell you how miserable it is to have to go to France to study somebody that you've been looking at for 5 years. It was wonderful. One of the prints, this is our trip in 2010. We stayed in Vence because that's, by conjecture, I think that's probably where Norma stayed for about 6 months, so we did the same thing. I even got titles of streets, so I found those streets, and of course, in Europe, they're still there, and probably almost the same pot plants and so on. Everything is still pretty much as it was 70 years ago. In St. Paul, one of the print titles was St. Paul. It had the term St. Paul in it, the word St. Paul in it. So here's the entry to this. This is the village of St. Paul. We entered right here, and we walked up the street, the Rue Grande. Let's see, sorry, it's this one, that way, like that. And since it had the title St. Paul in it, we thought we could find this fountain. First, when we came in, we saw this animal fountain, I call it, because the people who were standing there told me that it's really for the animals when they come back from being out. That this fountain, it's very low. It was only about 2 feet high. So that was for them. Other people could, it's clean water, but that was what they called it. And so we saw this fountain, and we saw the style of the fountain, this top. This is just a carved, simple top. It has an edge on it, but nothing complicated about it at all, just kind of an arc across the top. So fountains, like other things, have styles. And the Washerwomen of St. Paul, this is the wrong, they do have styles, but I'll talk about that in a minute. First, I want to talk about this particular view. So we found this view going up that route that I showed you. And about halfway up, we came to this. And it was called the Grand Fontaine. It's just kind of a wide spot in the walk. And there is this 19th century fountain in the foreground, and quite obvious. Somebody going by would look at that and say, yeah, there's a fountain there. And they would be thinking of the 19th century fountain. But in the back, if you look at the slide, in the back, there is this lavoir. This is a vaulted area. And this lavoir, that you find those commonly in towns that were part of the once Roman Empire, and they're Roman-based. You can see it there in that slide back there. She completely took this out. That wasn't her interest. But she did this view, and the people are standing there. We wondered if we'd also find Village Fountain, this other print called Village Fountain, which didn't have St. Paul in the title. We wondered if we'd find that also in Vence. Its style resembled that of that little fountain. You can see the curved top, very similar, and the water spout is about the same point. So we were suspicious that it might be there. And I showed this print to one of the people standing there, and she said, well, it could be, because this is the kind of fountain we make here. So higher up the walk in St. Paul, at a little place called La Placette, was the place where Norma found her fountain, and here it is. So her angle, she only did this part and then that part. Of course, all the background, she's just used a simple blue background so she can bring out her figures. And her focal point is a bit lower than this. I should have gone down a little bit when I took the photo, because right behind me was a step that was long ago walled in. I mean, the step was there, but the door behind it was walled in. And that's where she sat. And that tells me something. Her professional training taught her to have a place where you can stay for a long time when you are making any renderings or drawings, because you're going to need a long time and you don't want the sun to come around and hit you. So she was protected by the building behind her, and she had this view on which the sun was cast, or the light was cast, almost the whole day. So those things go together to make up a tantalizing set of circumstances for an artist, and it helps lend appeal to the subject. And this fountain I found while I was there, it's dated 1512, so just nice to know the date. So the Halls lived for about 6 months in another town, Villefranche-sur-Mer, which is just east of Nice on the Mediterranean coast. This is all in Alpes-Maritimes, the very southeast corner of France. They didn't go very far. None of these places are very far apart, and they didn't need to. They had all they needed right there. Here is Norma's view. In Villefranche-sur-Mer, I said to Jim with the postcard in my hand, they lived at Maison Sassot. Let's look for Maison Sassot. And Jim, my husband, who was with me, pointed behind me over my shoulder and he said, do you mean that Maison Sassot? And here it was. I can't believe that this could happen. How could we be standing in the right spot and then, number one, number two, have the name of the building on the building? I mean, you wouldn't have to have the name on all the other buildings didn't have a name. This had the name. And it was just so incredible that these circumstances all fell together. And in Norma's postcard, she said they lived on the 3rd floor. And so I took a picture of the whole building, and there it is. And that was at least for 6 months in 1926 they lived here, and including Christmas. High up in the village, on this street, little route called Rue Baron de Bray, we found the location of the street in Villefranche. Not only do the positions of the various buildings verify this, I'll point out, notice in the print, this cornice, how it changes angle right here. And notice this building that's standing out here, and the building here. So, and also even the plants. Here's the street. I was pretty close to where she was. There's it's hard to see, let's go to the next one for the cornice. Much easier to see here. It's right there, it turns. That is a shutter's shadow, so it makes it a little bit confusing. But the cornice is going along here, and then it angles and goes that way. So there's that. There's this building that's here no longer has a window, but it's still the same building. And this one looks like it's had stucco put on it, but it's also there. And there are even plants over here, and the reason is because that was a monastery. So it's something that's long-term, and that's why it all looks similar. So when you go back, you can see it's pretty obvious that that's where it was. And when she was there, apparently, women carried things on their heads, and they certainly don't anymore, but that tells you much more about the date and the period. And you can see the laundry hanging there. Also, you can see some of these could be laundry brackets right there for hanging laundry, there and there. I'm not sure. I don't see any laundry out, but they could be. We also found the locations where Norma stationed herself for the panorama Tourrettes-sur-Loup. This is the view we saw in 2010. We also found the panorama locations where she stationed herself on all the panoramas. The Halls rode bicycles from one village to the next, as I said, around the Alpes-Maritimes, where these villages with these perched villages sit. Here is Norma's rendering of that, her interpretation of that location. If you look, I'll go back to the actual photo in a second, but if you look for this portion of structure and a rather large couple of 2 or 3 buildings in front of a tower, and you look for the church tower, you'll see that they're all apparent. I believe that is that structure. I'm not sure from here. My angle's a little, is that right? Okay, yeah. And then the large buildings and the tower, which has been finished and restored, and then the church. So she was over where I am somewhere when I took this picture. And you can see there's a gorge between where the artist is and where the village is. And the roads in this area they just wind around so that there's no severe or steep climbing for any of the roads or any of the streets, but they gradually incline or decline. And that means they're going very serpentine all around. You drive a long time to get over there. And in this particular image, I think it was this one, or it might have been La Gaude, I'm not sure, one of the two. There was a wide spot in this narrow road, and it was where a gas station once was, but she could have used that spot and been out of the way. That's another thing. You just want to be out of the way of everybody so you can do what you want to do. Notice also this bokashi sky, the treatment of the sky with the blending of the colors. So you have down here at the bottom this dark red, suggesting a sunset. And this is probably meant to be another mountain behind the village hill. And then this gradation from there to there is done all in one stroke with a roller on the block. And that's all from there to there. It's one, it's the carved block, which is shaped like this, has that color applied that way, and that's how it's done. Does that make sense? Okay. I think all those prints are on display, aren't they, Liz? As I believe every one of these are upstairs. Although our trip to France may seem a bit frivolous, it was informative. And I've just mentioned a couple ways by seeing where Norma worked and what the situation was. European street scenes were voraciously sought by the etcher, who made them into quaint views non-existent in America. So that would be Arthur. He is making etchings while she's doing these block prints. And he was heavily influenced by the Chicago Society of Etchers, which emphasized this kind of quaint, picturesque European street scene idea with the etchings. Norma, impacted by her husband's interests, rendered them too. To be sure, she was happy to go to Europe, but I think she may not have accepted the picturesque street scene without Arthur's influence. Also, I could better picture what the Halls saw, as I just mentioned, what they chose from their environment and what they made out of those observations. I could better see how a piece of landscape became art. Norma was plein air trained. I read some diaries in which, they're in the book, some diaries when she was studying at the Portland Art Association, how she and her friends would go out in Portland and make drawings. And she took summer courses to be outside. Just the act of visiting these countries left me with the question of the impact of Europe on the two artists and their relationship with the rest of America, of the American world. Did others understand the Halls' experience? Did other Americans understand where they were coming from? It was remarkable that these two could go by ship, focus on their goals, and not be lulled by thoughts of adventure outside their artistic missions. Their relatives were impressed, even awestruck, that they went, and they treasure the prints and letters that they have from the halls. But I've often thought, what would someone who knew them in Santa Fe or in Wichita or in Oregon, what would they think of these people in the 20s who had gone to Europe for 2 years and come back with these works of art, and come back and made these works of art? They must have been, I think, kind of bewildered. I think some of the nephews and nieces were pretty much impressed by their stamina and their vigor and their enthusiasm, and they really remarked on how it was amazing that Norma the aunt went to Europe then. So I'm going to switch to some other ways of researching. Investigation for the researcher in an archive can be tedious in comparison to skylarking about in pursuit of your subject, but extremely rewarding if your hunches are borne out, or if at least you find something. So I'll give you one example. At the University of California in the Bancroft Library, I was looking at the Ina Sizer Cassidy papers. Ina Sizer Cassidy was an art critic and journalist and friend of the Halls who lived and worked in Santa Fe. I was trying to work out the peculiar circumstances regarding the Hall's purchase of the Cassidy's house in the early 40s, and that would help me in establishing when Norma made her first serigraph. That's worth talking about, and it's up in the gallery, the strange kind of situation that occurred with her first serigraph, and I was trying to work that out. Again, Norma was not concerned about dates, so I was just in the blind on that. I found that the journalist was desperate to sell the house in the late 30s, but the trail suddenly ended in the early 40s. However, to my surprise, I found that Ina Sizer and her husband Gerald Cassidy, well-known Southwest artist, lived in Villefranche-sur-Mer the same 6 months that Arthur and Norma did. So I was thinking I was going to find information on them from the 40s and find out what was happening in Santa Fe and how was it that the Halls bought the Cassidy's house. And instead, I find this information about what life was like in Villefranche-sur-Mer in 1926 and 27. And also, I thought that the Halls had just met the Cassidys, which is significant, but they didn't. They hadn't. They had known them already from the late 20s, all those years, and that just surprised me. So I got information on Villefranche-sur-Mer in 26 and 27 from the journalist instead of the 40s. So my hunch wasn't settled yet, but the archive proved valuable for this other information. It just wasn't what I expected. A point of attraction for me was Norma's successful marriage to another artist. Especially for women, one has to ask the marriage question. How does a marriage succeed? Especially when both are artists, if that third partner, art, gets in the way. Can a woman manage a career and still have a successful marriage? I wondered if Norma Bassett had to give up something to maintain the marriage and begin to look for clues. And of course, I'm assuming that I'm looking at what she might have to be doing. But here's what I found. To my surprise, through studying the exhibition lists, I found that it was Arthur who gave up something. My respect for him shot up. I mean, I didn't have any impressions especially, but when I saw that, I was just very impressed. The Halls managed a successful marriage because early on, when Norma announced that she had decided on block printmaking as a career, he abandoned the idea of becoming a block print artist. He turned to etching and watercolor and never made another block print. Isn't that amazing? He gave up, and Arthur Hall was a very gifted artist, and he could choose what he wanted pretty much, I think. And so he just left the block world to Norma. There was another recorded time when competition was implied but not allowed to overrun the artists. Norma wrote to Smithsonian curator Rule Tolman when they had that exhibition in the late 20s. She wrote to him saying, This is after the exhibition, she wrote, "My husband's failure to sell any etchings is not weighing heavily on his mind, especially since he was awarded a bronze medal at the International Exhibition of the California Printmakers this year. We were both pleased over that. I got no medal, so I needed the encouragement of those few sales. As you say, the next time we exhibit, he will probably get all the sales." I think she's very generous, but you see how kind and compatible the marriage was from comments like this. So in this slide, I want to show, I just love the team look of these two images. They're both done on a snowy day, perhaps in tandem, on the same snowy day. I just imagine them sitting beside each other on the edge of some cold road somewhere in Kansas on a cold, snowy day, but making the renderings that are going to be required to come up with their final products. Arthur's etching is made on a copper plate, and Norma's is, of course, a block print. So note in each print the locations of the silo on opposite sides of the barn. So here's the silo in the barn. There's the silo in the barn. So we have one of these prints is reversed, right, from reality. And the etching has to be that print. When the etching is made on a copper plate, then when it's printed, it's going to be in reverse. Whereas Norma can keep her, it's not impossible for an etcher to make it reflect reality, but very, very difficult. But with Norma, she could make a rendering, turn it over on the block, and then carve, and when it's printed again, it's back to being a positive image. And that's what happened here. That's why we have the reverse images. But I love them because they're both the same. I think they're almost the same size. And they're both from the same angle. It just looks like they're sitting. I imagine sitting in a cold car. I don't know. I have no idea. But anyway. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the Japanese method and how it impacted Norma. In the early 1920s, Norma suddenly saw her career path. She would make woodblock prints using the Japanese method. I think this is about 1922. Norma was introduced to the Japanese aesthetic at both the Portland Art Association School and at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And the systems taught at both of those schools would have been set forth by Arthur Wesley Dow. Disenchanted by the academic art education he was exposed to in Paris, Dow began a search for other approaches to art and discovered a book of hokusai sketches that greatly inspired him. It was from Ernest Fenollosa, curator of Japanese art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, that Dow derived his theories of art. Also, Fenollosa made available a huge collection of Japanese prints and sketchbooks for Dow to study. Dow taught at the Art Students League, Columbia, and Pratt, as well as in his own school in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Art students not attending any of these schools were nevertheless exposed to Dow's teachings through his many students that spread across the country. Failing those experiences for the budding artist, Dow captured their attention through his book, Composition. This particular copy is from the University of Oregon Library, published in 1899, and the librarians, we switched from the Dewey system a long time ago, but they kept this book, and there's maybe 100 books in the library that are a Dewey system. They're original books that they decided were valuable enough to not change. So that's preserved on the 7th floor, but, you know, it's there. So I thought that was wonderful. It was used by students at U of O. Very dog-eared and torn, and there's stains inside and so on. But that's because it was used heavily by art students even in art education at the University of Oregon. So from the late 19th century to the mid-1920s, the book was published in many editions. There is little doubt that Norma was inspired by Dow's students at the Portland Art Association and at the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as his book. In some prints of Cannon Beach, the expression of Dowian concepts of composition is unmistakable. On the cover of the jointly created Hall book, the foreground image of an irregular and asymmetrical form pushes the edges of the frame or is cut off, as seen in Dow's many studies and line drawings, and the two tones. I'll show you those 2 slides in a second. Here's what I'm talking about, this particular image. Both asymmetry and a strong foreground with a distant background are typical of these Japanese prints. Here are some images from the inside of Dow's book, Composition. So he's showing many ways that suit his definition of what the aesthetic approach should be by showing these sketches to students. So here's one which is just a line drawings. Here's another where he's shaded in part. So it's essentially representing 2 colors or 2 tones. So Norma, for sure, was exposed to this kind of work. Like Dow, so I threw this in, the Japanese image, where you have a strong, large foreground with a small background. This is where Dow derived his ideas, as well as Fenollosa. Like Dow, Bassett Hall looked to her surroundings for a source of expression and cultural identities. And so this is so very obvious. The Hall book, dealing with local land and water, reflects Dow's 1893 book of prints called Ipswich River. Here's Cannon Beach. There's Ipswich River. And this book was done, you can see at the bottom, it says Arthur Hall, Norma Hall. It says Arthur W.C. Hall, Norma B. Hall. And it's a joint book that they both made, and we have it on exhibition upstairs. And so it's very much worth looking at. This was found in a dresser, bottom of it. I mean, they knew it was there. It was being protected and cared for. It was in the bottom of a dresser drawer for something like 60 years, in perfect shape. So here's Arthur Dow's Along Ipswich River, which is also a series of images having to do with the Ipswich River. Bend of the river is one image. Here is Norma's Portree Bay. The similarities are striking. It's just a no-brainer to see where she got her ideas, or what the training is that she had, where she derived her composition. I think this is some ink or something maybe that got on the print that shouldn't be there. Another block print with a strong foreground. Dow's work is very beautiful. One thing about slides that's so deceptive that everybody should always be aware of is that, let's see if we can find an example. See the size, 5 inches by 2.5, this big. So what you're seeing is immense compared, and you have to remember that when you see it, because it changes the look completely when you're looking at a tiny print compared to that. It's very, very different emotional kind of feeling. And all these prints are small. The Hall's book is bigger. It's about 6 by 9 or something like that. Maybe even bigger. This print also is on display, and it's larger than the Dow prints. Here, Dow has used that pillar style, that pillar print style that's common in Japanese art. And that's the same thing that I showed you at the very beginning. That iris print is the same thing. It's this long, extended, vertical format that's common in Japanese art. This one we know. I mean, there's so many things about Dow that are hard to finalize because not all the records are there, and it's very difficult to sort out when somebody says of and someone else says in. Did Dow care, and are they the same print? So we have bend of a river, bend in the river. It's hard to really know. These two prints, though, that print and that one are from the same blocks. They're just printed in different colors. And when you go upstairs and you see the Navajo land that Norma did, we have 4 examples. One is an incomplete example in the process. It's called, she's written at the bottom, preliminary drawing, I think it was. It wasn't a drawing, but that's what she wrote. So and then the other 3 are complete prints, complete proofs, we would say, with all the colors applied, but they look very different. And it's the same thing here. Now, Dow is an experimenter, and that's what he loved to do, was take that's why he was carving blocks, because it's so much easier to carve a block and make quick studies by changing colors than it is to paint something or to draw something by hand each time. You had these blocks, you just print. So there are lots and lots of examples of Dow work where different colors are shown and he's interested in emotional impact. He's all about aesthetics. It's all about design, composition, the appeal of the work itself. It's not about any kind of critical commentary on society or anything other than just the single appeal of the work. Well, Norma was the only female charter member of the Prairie printmakers, but she was distinctive in other ways. The very fact that she was a color woodblock artist is somewhat unusual. And one working in Japanese methods, such as here, this is called a Highland Croft, in materials, was even more rare. Second, she was very unusual in that she was trained by students of the 2 greats of Japanese color block printmaking history, one from each side of the Atlantic, namely Arthur Wesley Dow in America, his home was Ipswich, and Frank Morley Fletcher, who was in Edinburgh. And finally, as I mentioned, Arthur left his influence upon her in that she enthusiastically pursued his interest in so-called picturesque subjects in Europe. While this choice of subject was not unique for the American color block artist, it's unusual that Norma chose these quaint streets and village scenes, such as Villefranche-sur-Mer in Provençal village, which in her hands seemed to have lost all the quaint aspects so desired by the etchers. All of these facts contributed to her distinction. So to really understand what I'm saying, it would probably be good if you looked at a number of etchings that are called, look at some of Arthur's work, like an obscure street or obscure road. Look at some of his works and then look at hers, and you'll see the emotional differences. Well, you'll know, you can make out that that's what it is, but that there's an emotional difference that's brought about. But with Norma, I'm sure that she was influenced by Arthur because she has written sometimes in the sides of prints or on notes. She's on this one print called A Covered Passage. It's a very small print, very much of a study at the very beginning of her career. It's in black and white, and the owner almost didn't send it to me. He didn't think it was important, but it was. In the covered passage, she says something like, "Where mysterious figures lurk in dark corners." That's trying to evoke that emotional status of the etcher And it's not really something you find among block print artists. Their goals essentially were different, and those goals were essentially what you see with Dow. And Dow only, in Norma's case, Dow is to be credited with the compositional creativity that she gained. And the composition, the aesthetic approach, nothing to do with actually carving the blocks. This is a big mystery for me and for my understanding of Dow, because while he taught, he was so wrapped up in design and composition that I'm sure he taught carving, but not to the degree that students really needed to really get into it. And I know that Norma felt that way because she was compelled to continue studying carving. She had the aesthetics, but she was compelled to study carving, and that is why she went to Scotland. However much she may have learned from Dow about technique, she did not feel sufficiently conversant with Japanese printing. And she attempted in El Dorado, Kansas, to learn through Frank Morley Fletcher's book, Woodblock Printing. This book is also a classic. This is a $200 book that the library was just letting anybody take. And it disappeared, and after about a year it came back. So then now I think it's better protected. It's very valuable. If you want to understand this, and it's just kind of a seminal work. So it was about this time, or a bit after, she worked up some prints of Cannon Beach, which are not done in the Japanese technique. Aesthetically, yes, but by technique, no. And when we go upstairs, I'll try to explain that if you'd like. I suspect she hoped to study with Morley Fletcher in Edinburgh, but about that time, Fletcher himself left for America. He went to California. And probably through his concern, she met his student, Mabel Royds, who was the one from whom she learned to actually do Japanese woodblock printing. Thus, although she was a generation too young to directly experience the two great masters of Japanese block printmaking in the West, i.e. America and Europe is what I mean, she did learn from their first generation students. Thus, she is rare in the sense that she was trained in the Japanese sensibility and technique by two different coexisting schools on each side of the Atlantic Ocean. I imagine there are some others that do this, but I don't know. I would have to think of other Americans who studied in Edinburgh would be the key. So probably the Halls told other people in family about their time in Villefranche in Europe, but we wouldn't know today except that someone kept a record in those eventful days. Some information is recoverable through deduction and other factual evidence, like an exhibition record or provenance, but events of importance are lost in the diliquescent passage of time. And that was the case with much of Bassett Hall's life. Hearsay from memory is uncertain unless it can be verified. The written word is king, especially if it too can be verified. There are still many questions I have about Norma and her art, but nevertheless, I decided I'd had sufficient material to put a book together, which the information had to be balanced over the years with no major gaps, and I think by almost luck, I managed to do that. So, I think Norma truly deserves the recognition she's gotten. I just think that banner outside, she would not believe if she came to Kansas State and saw that banner out on the beach museum. What is this? My print from 1949? But she was just a very humble person, very low-key, and she never bragged, or that was left to Arthur to do. He would speak up for the two of them. And I want to thank the beach for launching this exhibition. I think it's beautifully and informatively displayed, and I have a feeling it will be, and you've said it will be enjoyed by most visitors. So, I could go on, but I think I may have about done in my time. So, are there any questions?
If there are any questions, I'm going to hand you this. Oh, I turned it. Everything okay? Yep. Let me ask a question. Could you talk a little bit about their time in Kansas, the Halls?
Sure, sure. They came in 1922. They were married in 1922, and they came to Kansas in 1922. Arthur had been here before. He had worked in a couple of the county buildings as a court recorder. That means he did the recording of the evidence and the testimonies that were given in trials and other times when the court needed to have written material. That's what he did, and he used stenography. So perhaps he's just sitting there with a pen and a pencil or a piece of paper writing that down. That was his job. And when the Halls when they didn't have much money, which was most of the time, they relied on Arthur's income. But Norma never had to do anything she never had to do anything outside the world of art. She was always able to make art her career, which is pretty wonderful. So she did various things. She taught. In 1922, when they came to El Dorado, they lived there until 24 about. She and Arthur had a house that they rented, and she made a room into a studio, I guess you could say. And there is a report from her niece who said that they did some printing in the kitchen one Sunday. So, they used the house as their studio and so on. So they were there, and then they went to Europe. They were there until about June of 27, and then they came back to Kansas. And they were here in Kansas from sort of the middle of 27 up until 42 about. Then they went to Virginia for 2 years, and they built a house. They bought 48 acres, and they built a house in arts and crafts method. This is in Loudoun County, Virginia. And the place is so interesting, just another coincidence. It's so interesting that it's the town location. They're out in the country, but the town location is Bluemont, Virginia, and I'm staying in a Bluemont hotel, so it's kind of amazing. In the Bluemont Street I see here in town. So anyway, they were there until 44. Then they went back to El Dorado for 6 months or so, and I'm off a little bit on the dates. We don't know the exact dates, but I found her in a yearbook teaching in El Dorado for one term. I think it was from January until June of 40, maybe it was 44. We'd have to look in the book to be sure. Then, during that time, they were trying to buy this house in Santa Fe. And from Ina Sizer is writing in the late 30s, when Gerald died, she needed money. She was desperate for money. And so up until about 40 or so, she's constantly, this is all in her papers in Berkeley, she's constantly trying to sell the house and unable to do it. Then, as I say, that trail ended, but I found a bill of sale in some other papers, which was offered. The offer was made, but it wasn't finalized. So they were trying to buy it, but that didn't go through, it didn't work. And at that point, they went back to El Dorado for that 6 months or so. And that's where they didn't want people in Kansas to know that had happened. So when they came back, they were welcomed, and it was a good life for them for that amount of time, but they didn't really reveal what their plans were. So then finally, through R. Harold Nason, they were able to buy this house on Canyon Road, which is now a $4 million house. I've been to it twice, and it was for sale recently. So they bought the house then, and it would be about 1944, 45, 44 probably. And they lived there until then. So the time that Norma was most productive here was in the 30s, I think, is the time when she seemed to be the happiest and seemed to produce the most wonderful prints having to do with landscape. And we have the ones that are on view are good examples. So, and Arthur just plodded on with his etchings. He was kind of steady. Etching was very, very popular then, and block print making wasn't. So he was the one who was making the sales. In general, that was the case. Then the times changed. So I think the landscape images that show the trees, like golden maple, for example, there's one, I'm not sure if it's on exhibit here, but there's another one made about that time, and the book gives a listing of all the awards that every print won. There's another one that won something about that time that's also kind of a landscape. So does that help? Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Jane?
I have a question about Hayne in Vermont.
Oh, yeah.
Did they, I don't think they lived there, but did they visit relatives?
Yep. Norma had, she had a sister who was, I think, about 12 years older than she was. And that sister proved to be invaluable for Norma in her life. She had two other brothers, but one disappeared completely, and the other one, there was some other crisis around World War I. I don't remember, but they don't play a role in her life. So there were 4 children, and Norma was 10 or 12 years younger than the oldest child, the oldest daughter. And that daughter got a job teaching in Portland, teaching school in Portland. And that's, the parents would not let their 8th grade child go to Portland from Halsey without some reliable way to make sure she was safe. So she talked them into letting her live with her sister, and the sister agreed. And that's how she got to Portland. And then she, I think she finished some schooling there too. Then she applied in 1906 to enter the school of the Portland Art Association. And her, sister had 2 or 3 children, and one of them was the one who bought the farm in Vermont. And the other, so this is a nephew. She's going to, Hayne in Vermont is at her nephew's house. And the other nephew, I've forgotten where he was, I don't think, but that's significant for that print. And it's the only one. She'd just gone there on vacation. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
How does Norma stack up with, other greats like Gustav Bauman or Francis Gearhart or some of the maybe earlier great ones?
Well, Bauman has been given his due. I mean, he has been highly recognized. And did everybody hear the question? How does Norma stack up against greats like Gustav Bauman and who did you say? Francis Gearhart, yeah. Neither one of those artists used the Japanese method. So they're somewhat different in their realm, if you will. But Bauman certainly was a colorist. He got that right away, and his work is so incredible, the way he knew how to blend colors, how to mix, how to make tones go together so well. Gearhart, Norma, I'm pretty sure, I'm almost positive, but I don't have proof. I don't have a piece of paper that shows it, but I'm pretty sure she communicated with Gearhart, because Gearhart lived in Pasadena, and she had occasional exhibitions in her house. She started in the late 20s having them annually. She and her, she had sisters too. So they all started having these exhibitions that they would just hold in their house. And in some of those exhibitions, Norma exhibited. So they probably mailed prints back and forth. Gearhart was a member of the Printmaker Society of California, and so were the Halls. And one might say, I'd said a long time ago, how come they're joining the Printmaker Society of California? But I think I got that figured out. I think Seward, who was from here, is from Wichita, I believe. C.A. Seward was, they all became friends, and the Halls spent a lot of time in Wichita, even though they lived both in Howard and El Dorado. They would drive up to Wichita. And I think C.A. Seward encouraged them to send in some prints to the California printmakers, and Printmaker Society of California it's called. And the reason I think that is because the very same year that the Halls exhibited at the PMSC, so did Seward. And he hadn't exhibited before in that, and he didn't exhibit afterwards. So I think there's probably a connection. He may have encouraged them to send something in. And that was a fantastic thing for Norma, because it so happened that Frank Morley Fletcher, that she wanted to work with in Edinburgh, had come to California, and he was on the board, or he was on the jury for the PMSC. He saw her prints. He saw Iris. He saw another print that's not on exhibit here. It's actually a California scene. It's a very low-key, kind of simple scene. She exhibited that, and then she exhibited this other one called In the Forest. But those prints were seen by Fletcher when he'd never heard of her, probably. Had no idea who she was. They came in, they were chosen, and then and Seward's works were exhibited that year too. And then I think maybe Norma said, you know, can I study under you? No, sorry, you're here. You're in California and you're not doing it anymore. But he probably said, why don't you contact my student, Mabel Royds? That's how I think it worked. I have no proof for any of it, but I've thought about it a lot. So she was an oil-based artist, like Bauman. And she gained a lot of popularity early. I think Norma could have, but she didn't push herself, and she didn't really work she did exhibit, but she just didn't work at gaining attention. I don't have any other better answer. I don't know. I think her work is as good. It's different, but there was an appeal that Gerhardt had for, it struck a lot of people, and you know, she is very popular still. Yeah.
Did I remember correctly that when they traveled to England, they spent time with Mabel Royds, and was it Lumsden that was her husband?
Yes, this is another unbelievable thing.
And maybe that's where Arthur Hall got his training in etching?
Exactly.
Is that right?
So how perfect is this? Norma goes and studies with Mabel Royds, and well, meanwhile, her husband studies with Mabel's husband because he's an etcher. So it's just such a picture, a storybook picture, perfect. Yeah. And Lumsden was very famous at that time. In 1924, he published a book called The Art of Etching, right when they were going, just a year before. So, yeah, it's kind of an amazing story. I've tried so hard to find connections. I found Mabel Royd's grandson. His name is Anthony Barton. He lived in somewhere in northeast Canada. And he told me what he knew, but it wasn't very much. He admitted, though, that Mabel used breadboards. So, yeah.
Follow-up question. Do you think she had any understanding or dialogue with Walter Phillips, the Canadian that came from?
They certainly are similar. No, I'm just guessing no. Because he worked in Canada, and I think of him as really being a rural Canadian. I don't think their realms ever crossed. I just saw, I was in Canada this summer, and I saw some of his works and talked to some people who know have information, but I'm not able really to draw any conclusions. His work is much more particularistic and kind of small and detailed and sensitive, but not, she's more, how do I put it? Her zones, her color zones are bigger and more expressive in the sense that they're in your face more, maybe. Whereas Walter Phillips does small things, like he might even do a fishing line, or something like that. I don't see them related stylistically, but he did use the Japanese method. Yeah, and he was a contemporary.
Well, I think, Joby, you'd probably be glad to answer additional questions while you're
Sure.
signing your book?
And I'm actually not even done with this lecture if anybody wants to hear more. I've got more stuff here, so. But I'd be glad to go upstairs and it's kind of fun to look right at the prints and to look at what the prints tell us and try to take it from there. So I hope nobody wanders off. Come upstairs and let's look.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're good.